Welcome to the Gulf of Mexico Blue Plague Update with Living Light Network host Michael Edward, who reminds us all, wherever the Gulf wind blows and the Gulf water flows. And here's Michael with the latest Gulf update.
Well, thank you, Bill. That's our announcer, Bill. We moved over. If you haven't noticed, we're on a different channel on Blog Talk Radio. We're at Living Light Network. Just moving everything to the way it should be. All our archives are sitting back there on our old site. And if you had gone there on Blog Talk Radio, that's blogtalkradio.com/WVP is our old site. And all our archives are there, previous shows, they will stay there. But for clarity, we wanted to turn around and have a new channel with the name of our network so that there wasn't any confusion any longer. So we're over here at blogtalkradio.com/Living Light Network. So this is our new home. The call-in number has changed. It's now 424-258-9302. And as I found out, my host PIN number and other things had changed. This is our first show on the new channel here at Blog Talk Radio. So I apologize for the delay of a little bit over a minute to get this show started, but we got it all worked out. We have a fantastic guest today. I've spent a good couple hours just trying to go over some of the things on her internet sites, and it's just mind-boggling. Our guest is Rosalind Peterson, and she's out from California. Her two internet sites, I don't think I've ever seen more articles referencing more different things. You want to talk about a library of information. You have to go to her sites. Her two main sites are agriculturedefensecoalition.org, and her second site, just as profound, is californiaskywatch.com. So much information there, you'll almost get lost. I did, and she had forwarded some things for me to try to go over before the show today, and I was just overwhelmed. So I just want to remind everybody, if you're in the chat, you'll see Lynn posting up the links to her main sites. I'll give them to you again for those who are listening in archives of this show. californiaskywatch.com, agriculturedefensecoalition.org. She's also got her articles in News with Views under her heading Peterson, Rosalind Peterson. You can find it there. Just look her up. She's been putting a lot of information about weather modification and such. And I wanted her on the show because there's obviously a lot of weather modification that has been going on, especially since last year with the Gulf, when all of a sudden no hurricanes showed up here. And to most people, it's all seemed odd. Oh my goodness, how could that happen? But nobody's really answering it. And that's the reason that I feel it's really important with our guest to clue us in today. Rosalind is, as I said, has just got so much information about weather modification, and she's going to talk today about how that applies to the Gulf of Mexico and things like the Navy 5-year warfare plan that will affect a lot of things with the Gulf of Mexico. So we're all going to get updated big time today. We've got a 2-hour show here on our new Blog Talk Radio channel, Living Light Network. So without any further ado, Rosalind, thank you for joining us today. It's really a pleasure.
Well, it's an honor to be here on your show with you today, and thank you very much for having me.
Well, I was told if we wanted to get answers, you were the one. So there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm sure the people in chat are going to be posting questions, and as we go along, even other callers may ask questions. So I will ask you my own and also their questions as well as we go along. And just to A reminder that at the top of the hour, after our first hour, we will have a 5-minute break so you can take a slight breather and get a sip of ice water.
Okay, that sounds wonderful.
Okay, well, my first question is, and I know you've got so much on your sites about this whole new subject of weather geoengineering. And I had a couple questions. I'd like you to give us, first of all, a little summary of what the heck is weather geoengineering. And I'd like you to go in after you give us a summary. What's all this with the ocean fertilization, and are they doing this in the Gulf, and how does it affect this? So give us a little rundown. What is weather geoengineering?
Well, let me kind of define geoengineering. What is happening is that programs are now being discussed or have been implemented that would change our atmosphere or our oceans, adding particles, chemicals, gases that are going to make changes supposedly to reverse global warming. But in essence, these particles and chemicals and gases would be added to oceans or released in the upper atmosphere, and they would change the climate. They would reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, or in the case of ocean iron fertilization, would put a dust in the ocean, an iron dust into the ocean, to create artificial algae blooms. And this has been done off the California coast by Climos and Planktos, and other experiments have taken place, and they know now from their testing that it doesn't work, and it has a negative impact on ocean environments. So some of these plans are still continuing, even though they're having adverse effects. And one of the things that would happen if they did ocean iron fertilization in the Gulf of Mexico would be to create these artificial algae blooms. And then once you have these blooms, it cuts off oxygen to the plant life there when it starts to decay. And so then you can have the death of, in other words, fish and other things that depend on this ocean and the oxygen in the ocean. So there's a number of things that can happen during the course of ocean iron fertilization. The other plans are to have what they call global geoengineering governance, in which we experiment releasing toxic chemicals or gases like sulfur into the atmosphere to put up particles that reflect the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. But when you do this, you change the weather, the ocean weather and the land weather, because you're reducing the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. And you're also then starting other problems, like you're going to have more acid rains, more tree decline, more water and air pollution. Or another geoengineering project, as another example, is to put salt particulates into clouds in order to whiten them and make them more reflective. The only problem is that when these salt particulates rain out, and they rain out more quickly than other types of particulates, they could rain out over your water supply, your soils, your watersheds, forest lands, and you could deliberately impair the soil and the ability of soil to produce crops.
So they're using, you said, salt particulates, and is this what I saw on your site called the whitening of clouds, cloud whitening?
Yes, one of the experiments that Bill Gates is paying for is to whiten clouds and to see if they can be more reflective so that less sunlight reaches the Earth. And this is supposed to cool us down, but I think it's going to have a negative effect. And also, when you start to reflect direct sunlight back away from the Earth, then we're going to lose photosynthesis, which is required for all ocean plants and all, in other words, crops and trees and everything to grow strong and healthy. You begin to not have so much photosynthesis taking place where plants absorb the energy directly from the sun to grow strong and healthy and produce crops.
Well, are they doing this now? Is this something that's being done, or is it just experimental at this point?
It's experimental at this point, not widely experimental, but the U.S. House Science and Technology Committee and the UK Parliament are in negotiations about setting up global geoengineering governance, where from their hearings they want to experiment more and more with these programs to help us cool the planet. But you see, the thing is that when you reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, you're going to negatively impair crop production, you're going to negatively impair the ocean climate, and, in other words, the normal growth and function of direct sunlight hitting the ocean.
Oh, gee, sounds like a great plan. I just wonder how they come up with these things and how they possibly think this is supposed to help. Sometimes it boggles my mind with some of these experiments. Yeah, you opened a Pandora's box, because I was reading a lot. I think there were like 20 different articles on your site about Bill Gates and his plan to stop hurricanes and his patent. Apparently, he's got a patent for controlling hurricanes. Could you explain what that's all about?
Well, one of the things that NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NASA, the U.S. Air Force, private corporations, and private individuals like Bill Gates are planning to do is to, and there's some university professors and different ones studying this, but what they wanted to do was figure out how they could control the pattern of hurricanes so they can deflect them from one place to another. And so what they've done is they've started to, Bill Gates has got some patents, and a private corporation called Dynamat is looking at this gel, which is highly toxic to marine life. And if you put it in the clouds, what it does is it absorbs the moisture in the clouds and dissipates them. But when this gel falls as this goo onto Earth, then it's toxic to aquatic organisms. So these experiments by private corporations and different individuals and government agencies and the military are trying to control the weather patterns and to control hurricanes. And one of the things that Bill Gates is experimenting with is controlling hurricanes. Great.
Well, I think maybe we saw some of his efforts, or at least military efforts, this last summer. We didn't have a single hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and in fact, the last one that came out of the Southwest Caribbean started to head up towards the Yucatan Peninsula into the Gulf of Mexico and did a U-turn right into Cuba. How does something like that happen? Any ideas?
Yes. MIT professor Emmanuel, about 3 years ago, was suggesting that a fleet of jet airplanes, and this was on the Discovery Channel, so anyone can look up his quotes, and directly what he was talking about, it was a program on hurricanes, and what he was saying is that they could use a fleet of jets to put up carbon black or soot into the atmosphere in California and other states and start, and this soot would heat up and create these weather fronts. It's called a perturbation, as they call it, and what they do is it's a disturbance, and as these carbon black particles heat up and move across the United States, they start moving across on the jet stream, but they start escalating in how harsh the weather is as they move. So you're going to have severe weather escalating across the United States. In order to drive the front all the way across the United States, escalating, and then have it drive offshore. In other words, to hit a hurricane about the same time that a hurricane would be starting to come toward the shore, either in the Gulf states or along the Atlantic, and then drive that storm and turn it. Well, from the time of inception of seeing this program, we begin to see the black contrails here, and we begin to see these escalating weather patterns starting to occur about the time that the hurricane season was to begin. And in watching them, weather maps and watching weather channels and different things, we could see these patterns moving across. And when the hurricane was announced, you would see these weather patterns actually coming out and moving the hurricane in one direction or another, or pushing it offshore. And since the introduction of this idea, we haven't had a hurricane hit your area. We've seen them deflected, and we think that this is what's happening.
Yeah, something's deflecting them because total unnatural, typical weather patterns with the hurricanes last year, and even back in 2004. I was one of those who was ground zero with Hurricane Charlie, and we saw it do basically a 90-degree turn and come up the Peace River here in southwest Florida. They had already pretty much evacuated, shut off the electric in Tampa because they said, well, it's going there for sure. Somehow, mysteriously, it just makes this right-hand turn. So to me, that was my first introduction, being right smack in the middle of it, of weather manipulation, and that's why I started to look into it a little bit. But I haven't got a tenth of the information of what you've got. So that's why it was important to me to have you on here. I need to be educated as well because I want to know how they're doing all this. It's something that you had sent me, where you said that the U.S. government or even a state government, their laws, according to those laws, anyone can modify the weather without public consent, which I never knew. So us, the public, Joe Blow, somebody can be modifying the weather without us knowing about it, without our consent, and there's no oversight. Is that still true now?
That is still true to this day. I've talked to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and other government agencies, and there is no law that says that in other words, that there's any controls over anyone who wants to modify the weather. They can use any method, any type of modification, any chemical, any particle, any program. And as long as, for example, I can hire a weather modification company right now, and I can ask them to enhance the snow over Mendocino County where I live, for example, if I want to do that. If I have the money, I just pay them and they do it. So you can have private interests modifying the weather, and there's no, for example, in California, there's no state law or county law or city laws or any laws where there's any oversights over the more than 30 programs going on just in the state of California. Now, this is true for the entire United States with the exception of Texas, which has a weather modification board, and the people are charged for a small amount for implementing these programs. But in the panhandle of Texas, many of the ranchers are upset because the water, the rainfall is deflected away from them and puts them in drought conditions, whereas it rains out somewhere else. And Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, for example, every year since 2005 has introduced legislation in the U.S. Senate in order to have a weather mitigation or modification program to spend at least $10 million a year, and that a board would be set up, and anyone, any government agency, any individual, anyone would be able to modify or mitigate the weather, but there's no public consent. In other words, that's gone. No public consent, no congressional oversight, no state oversight. But right now, any city, state, county, individual, private corporation, government agency, university, anyone can modify the weather at this point. And if you have the money, you can hire companies to do it, or you can conduct your own experiments.
And there's no law, no codes, no nothing that that control any of this. So somebody, just if they had the money, on a whim could turn around and cause a storm with a lot of damage because he doesn't like that place, or he wants to clear out the property so he can own it. I mean, I know that sounds absurd, but if there's no state control, if there's no federal control, if there's no regulations, except for Texas, as you said. They have their control board. But that means people like Bill Gates, who has this patent that was on your site, who wants to control the hurricanes. A private individual like Bill Gates with a lot of money basically can do whatever he wants. And like you just said, corporations like BP perhaps could control the weather, and nobody's going to stop them. That's almost hard to believe, but I had known about this, and I had known about Texas a little bit when I was looking into it after 2004. I just had thought that at this point we had some regulation somewhere with it, or more states had the type of regulatory control boards, or at least advisory boards, as Texas has. So this is kind of a shocker to me, which means that our weather in the Gulf of Mexico, well, we've got a lot of possibilities and of to who was controlling the weather. It could have been even perhaps BP, a corporation, to make sure that their mess in the Gulf this past hurricane season would stay there until their efforts to try to supposedly clean it up would be done. That's not too far from reality, is it?
No, I don't think it's no. Based on the state of the art of weather modification right now, I think it's a good possibility. And also, I think I sent you a letter, but there's a letter on my website from the Executive Office of the President of the United States Office of Science and Technology, and it was written to Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison about her weather modification bill. But what he notes in this letter, and this was John H. Marburger III, Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And what he wrote was this. He wrote about local, political, and legal ramifications. It says, because small-scale weather modification, example, cloud seeding, may promote rain in one area to the detriment of another, weather modification could result in interstate litigation or private citizen litigation against the modification programs. The legal and liability issues pertaining to weather modification and the potential adverse consequences on life, property, and water resource availability resulting from weather modification activities must be considered fully before the U.S. government could take responsibility for this new research program spoken about in her bill. And it has international and foreign policy implications as well, and national security implications also. But the thing is that if people knew that their weather was being modified without their consent and they had adverse weather consequences, then they could sue who was ever doing the weather modification. That's why they don't want you to know who's modifying the weather at any level, because if you suffered these adverse consequences, then you would think it was natural or unusual events. You wouldn't understand that most of the weather happening some places in the United States, for example, is modified by a corporation, an individual, the university, or some experimental group that wants to experiment on us.
I don't think the average person could even understand that concept. They would think it would be ridiculous, like, well, no, you can't control the weather. That's part of Mother Earth. God controls the weather. And that's really the mindset of the average person. I know different because of what I looked about weather control, especially with the military involved. Let's get into that, because here we've got their airplanes, cloud seeding. I believe that I read something where you had said that this cloud whitening that you just mentioned before was involved, and then the salt, those kind of things. And I know the military, especially U.S. Air Force, has been involved with this for many years. In fact, they wrote Owning the Weather. I'm trying to remember the name of that article. I've even got it on my site. I'm sure you know it by heart, with the military owning the weather.
Yes, Owning the Weather in 2025, and there's a whole series of chapters, but then there's several hundred documents all talking about owning the weather in 2025 or alternate futures where you use weather modification as a coercion against other countries. And so the military's been very interested in learning how to control the weather, and part of the time I think they're experimenting on us. But it's to the detriment of agriculture, crop production in the United States. It's to the detriment of our oceans. These experiments that are ongoing, any rockets are used because they can more evenly disperse particles, chemicals, or gases. Then you can have large jets, you can have small airplanes, you can have ground-based cloud seeding generators and other things. So the methods, the chemicals, all these things can be used, and people won't even know that this is happening.
So what's some of the byproducts of these weather manipulation programs? What do we have? What particular chemicals that you can think of or other things are involved with this that could not only destroy our air that we're breathing, but agriculture, as you said? What kind of examples of these products that are coming out of the sky through these experiments? What are we facing? Well,
we're facing any number of experimental type trials in different size particulates. We're talking about Dynamat Corporation is using a gel. They kept it secret until one of the reporters that I know discovered what it was, and then we found out that it was highly toxic. But anything can be used, and that's the problem, is that there's no control on what particles, what chemicals, what gases can be used into the atmosphere. Now, most people have heard of silver iodide, and silver iodide is one of just several things that can be used. But salt, they're talking about, well, they like salt more. And the reason that they like salt at this particular juncture in time is because it can rain out faster. It whitens clouds for one of their experiments. In other words, it has, in other words, potentials for different types of programs that they want to do. On the other hand, then you have the ground-based chemicals like propane, shooting propane up into the air. There's all kinds of, in other words, they use some ammonia compounds sometimes, liquid propane. They've talked about silver iodine, another one that's going up, and some of these have health effects if used in any great amounts. So we're really concerned with lead and iodine being used. But right now, no one has any control over what's being used, and no one has any control over the health effects getting into air, water, different things.
So this is amazing. I'm really taken back. I thought there was some kind of control somewhere. But with the military, well, I should know better because they'll do that for national security, supposedly. I'm really, you almost got my breath, Rosalind, on this, because I thought for sure there was some kind of regulation somewhere. But, I guess we're all learning because we thought the same thing, that there were regulations in force of drilling oil and safety and things like that in the Gulf of Mexico and everywhere else, even, out there in California where you're at. We thought those regulations were supposed to be enforced, just like the financial SEC regulations were supposed to be enforced. And I guess we're all finding out, even if there are regulations, it doesn't mean a whole lot. But here with weather manipulation, there's just nothing at all. It's just wide open, free for all. And we don't even have to be told what they're using.
That's correct. And here's the other issue, too, is that, for example, there was an aluminum oxide dust cloud on September 19th, 2009 that was put up over the eastern seaboard by the U.S. Navy and NASA. They used a NASA Brant rocket. Well, the thing was, I got wind of this just a few days, and then there was a delay due to weather, but I got wind of this a few days before it happened because there was an article, and in the article, this Navy expert, he says, we can just use the atmosphere as a physics laboratory for experiments. And this means that we can do more experiments. And I'm appalled that we depend on this, in other words, the snow, the rain. We depend on weather for agricultural crop production. We depend on it for life on Earth. And here we have government agencies and military deciding that they're going to use our atmosphere and our upper atmosphere as physics laboratories. It's absolutely stunning.
Yes, it is. That's why I say I'm almost at a loss for words, because it's almost hard to believe in one respect. Then when you realize to me, the greed, follow the money of corporations and such. He who has the control controls all the people, controls the food. It does kind of make sense if you were in that kind of a frame of mind, and I guess in my book, really that evil that you wanted to control weather so that you could starve people, or you could flood them out, or you could destroy their crops. This is a powerful weapon. I just hope
it's a tremendously powerful weapon, and we used it in the Vietnam War. Because what we did is we perfected military weather modification operations during the Vietnam War when we kept the Ho Chi Minh Trail in rainy conditions for years and flood stage. And in other words, Operation Popeye. There's a whole bunch of operations that were exposed after the war, and in other words, now we've signed a treaty where it's against the law to use weather modification programs in war, but since we don't declare war on anyone anymore, we could be using these type of operations or using them over countries in which they have no idea that we're conducting these weather modification operations. So, and they're conducting them in the United States. There's more than 60 ongoing weather modification programs in the western United States, and our weather modification companies here in the United States definitely admit, even on television, that they're modifying the weather in more than 50 countries.
So we have established companies. Let's just talk about North America. We have established companies that can be hired at any time. As you said, whoever has the money, if you've got the money, you can have the weather modified. How many of these companies do you know so far that exist that basically are weather manipulators for hire?
There's more than a dozen of them. If you look at weather modification companies on the Internet, you'll get companies like, for example, Weather Modification, Inc. There's a number of them in North and South Dakota, and it's easy to find them. And they have websites, and they tell you how wonderful the work they do is. And many of them admit that they're modifying the weather in foreign countries as well. I put a lot of them up on my website, agriculturedefensecoalition.org, and if you go to the weather modification section, I do list a number of companies there and their websites, so you can go and look at what they do and look at what they've been doing in past years, because they're so proud of what they do that they'll tell you where they've modified the weather and sold their equipment in other countries, things like that.
There was an article that you wrote in 2007. As I try to explain it, you had sent me so many links and articles, I was overwhelmed. So I tried to pick out some things that to me I thought were important with the Gulf. Just a lot to read. I said in the beginning, you've got a library with all this on your site. So I'm just amazed. I've never seen anybody put that much information on an internet site. So you get that award without a doubt. But in 2007, you wrote an article where you were quoting out of a Popular Science magazine in 2005, where there was a plan to use an oil slick to stop hurricanes.
That's correct.
That one really caught my eye, because here we are in the Gulf. We've got an oil slick, and here we've had hurricanes stop. Do you think possibly that could have been part of the factor of why we didn't have hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico last year?
It's quite possible. It's hard for me to know because I haven't seen any studies about it, but it's quite possible. Wow.
I was just guessing when I was reading that 2007 article you wrote, especially that section. I was thinking, hurricanes depend primarily on, especially coming into the warm waters of the Gulf, of basically sucking up that warm water. Then I thought, if there's an oil slick on there, it's not going to be sucked up into the clouds in its normal, natural way. And maybe that, it's not that far of not being a possibility. Perhaps the oil on the water just might end up being one of those factors of why a hurricane just starts to die out. But to say that they were doing studies in it in 2005, Popular Science magazine is a pretty well-respected magazine, and I'm sure that most people never caught that article.
Well, that's why I put it on the website. And then when you asked me about all of my research, I started doing an investigation in 2002. And, of course, it outstripped my first website, which was CaliforniaSkywatch.com, capability at that time, because it was an old program when I started it. And so I finally decided that I had so much information that I would categorize it and put up a website called the AgricultureDefenseCoalition.org, because I wanted to talk about some of the impacts of these programs on agriculture, crop production, rainfall totals, watersheds, tree health, all of these different things. And that's how this website got started. And so over time, I've just been able to add to it. So instead of having my research stuck on my hard drive on my computer, I decided to put it out there so that people could really begin to understand that a lot of these things were really happening, and I put up the documents to show that they were. And I'd like to read something. It's brief.
Absolutely. No, you take your time, because we're all getting an education, and you're our teacher right now. So whatever you want, fill us in. What's going on?
Well, one of the things that happened is Pacific Gas and Electric Company modifies the weather in the state. It's one of the companies that modifies the weather in the state of California. And what happened is there's a document that I have that's filed with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and this is a November 2005 document, which is online. It's a final environmental impact statement about the Upper North Fork Feather River project in California. But on page 338, which I'm going to put on my website shortly, it describes PG&E's plans that they've been doing for many, many years to increase the snowfall in the upper part of this basin. And it says here, and I quote, PG&E uses 9 cloud seeding burners which vaporize a silver iodide acetone solution and form microscopic-sized crystals. During the 12 winter seasons between 1989 and 2001, the cumulative operation of cloud seeding burners ranged from 44 hours to 3,808 hours. PG&E estimates that the operations released an average of 102 pounds of silver iodide into the atmosphere per year during the winter storm periods. Now, for example, acetone is toxic. You're not supposed to have acetone in your water. And these are ground-based seeders, and where they shoot these chemicals up into the air. And this is common in other areas of the United States as well. This is just one type of project, but they enhance the snow, or they can enhance rainfall in certain areas so that you can have higher snow amounts. Other programs will dissipate clouds so that they won't rain out over a certain area, so that they can deny you fog or deny you cloud cover. They can deny you rainfall in one area so that they can have more clouds and more rainfall in another area as well. And then they seed the clouds in those areas, and they can kind of move things around from one place to another.
It kind of sounds like weather all across North America lately.
Yes,
things just don't seem to be going normal, and some very odd storms, and then odd droughts coming when they shouldn't, odd rainfall when it shouldn't. I guess everybody's got their hand in it on how they're going to manipulate every part of the country with weather.
Yes, I sent you a listing of 66 weather modification programs that are ongoing in California, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, and Texas as just one, and then there's some going on in Florida. The military's doing experiments there. But there's also weather modification programs going on in Alberta, Canada, and the country of Mexico, as well as Alaska. But you see, as each one of these places decides that they're going to take and add more and more snow or more rainfall to one area, what they're doing is they're depriving and putting into drought other areas. And see, this is where your ranchers and your farmers and many people that I talk to don't know that this is even happening, so they don't know that their crop is being destroyed because of these events.
So
lack
who
of
wins?
water, too much rain, etc.
Who's the winner? The one with the most money?
Well, the people that are doing the projects, for whatever reason, are winning. But you see, the thing is that if a ski resort wants more snow, they can hire a company to put more snow over the area of their ski resort, and they can deprive another area, watershed, of enough snow. In other words, for the trees and the water that's needed to run down those rivers and streams when it melts.
Wonderful. It's to me, again, it's mind-boggling that
yes,
anybody can, if you had the money, any corporation, we've got these professional weather modification companies, you can hire them so that you can turn around and have more rainfall for your crops, and yet the guy that's 20 miles away gets an absolute drought because you've taken his rain, so to speak. So this is truly weather wars. It really is. It's not just modification. It's wars. What happens if you have different companies, or the military, or this government, or this state government, or this local government, and they're all involved in a particular area? You could literally have weather wars going on to see who's going to win to get their way.
But
it's a war.
Sometimes they don't know that another program is happening at the same time, or in another location nearby. They may have no way of knowing because there's no real. The reporting requirements are minuscule, if any, and most state programs in different states aren't even the weathermen don't know about it. The National Weather Service may not know about it because there's no agency that oversees who can do what and when, and put some restrictions on type of chemicals and types of programs so that it doesn't destroy agricultural fields and crops. It doesn't, and that's our food supply, by the way. Mm-hmm. So I can tell you I'm really concerned about this issue because I worked for many years for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in California in the Farm Service Agency. I also worked in agriculture for the Mendocino County Agricultural Commissioner's Department, and I also worked for as a crop loss adjuster where we addressed crop losses throughout California. And I can tell you that most of the crop losses are weather-related. But when you start adding all of these weather modification programs ongoing, you have the potential to destroy either the water supply for agricultural crop production or to stop the rainfall or cause flooding in areas so that these farmers and ranchers will go nowhere each year.
That's not good news, but it's reality. Again, I'm just taken back. I had figured that there was weather manipulation, and more so for the fact of, okay, let's re-steer a hurricane to do this way to cause less damage. And I was thinking the innocent way that, okay, that's good for everybody, but it can go the other way too. It can be, let's cause some destruction in this area. That's the sad part. And again, no regulation, no laws, no nothing. Of course, like I said earlier, regulations sometimes don't mean anything, but just the sense that this is a free-for-all.
Well, it's a free-for-all, but I'd like to make a comment about the Gulf of Mexico. Even though I know when hurricanes hit land, they do a lot of damage, but there are a number of credible studies, some of which I put up on my website, stating that the impact of hurricanes when they cross the ocean and they mix the cooler water with the warmer water, and they cause a mixing action at all levels of the ocean when they cross and when they move. Mm-hmm. And they said that in the Gulf itself and also along the Atlantic seaboard and other island areas, when this churning occurs from these hurricanes, it actually cleanses and cleans the ocean, and it's beneficial for all forms of life because then you get oxygen down into these lower levels, and this churning really improves the conditions of the environment for all species when this churning occurs. So to say that hurricanes are all bad and have no beneficial, in other words, use, is not quite true because of this cleansing action and this stirring and churning that's created in these various ocean areas.
So without that occurring in the Gulf last year, then basically we had a further lack of oxygen getting into the water to stir it up, so to speak. In fact, there were a lot of things that BP was saying about, and there were different agencies saying different things about what would happen if a hurricane came last summer, why all this soil was so prominent and everywhere, and still is, which is why I'm wondering, perhaps this year, 2011, we'll have a repeat of last year, and we'll further stagnate the Gulf of Mexico with no hurricanes, and even a further reduction of oxygen and the natural things that would normally occur with storms coming up. That what you said makes a lot of sense. Oxygen is important. That stirring with the tides and storms and such is very important for the ecology with the oceans, for plant life, fish life. That's nature's way. So if we're stopping that, then we're interfering with nature and causing even worse problems.
That's probably true in the long run. So the idea that that we may protect some segment, but we're going to stop this from happening, the future repercussions of that could be tremendous. And so I think that all these modifications and weather programs and hurricane modifications and all the things we're trying, not only are we using toxic chemicals in many cases to do it, or particles, but our experiments are experimental, and we don't really know the consequences of that, although we do know that when you leave things in Mother Nature alone, sometimes all of these things that are happening rejuvenate the earth and revitalize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just like forest fires. It's already proven when you have a fire, all the new growth that comes from it. Of course, deliberately setting one to destroy, and some things have been set deliberately that got out of control. We have controlled fires here in Florida. When it gets dry here in southwest Florida, and actually almost all of Florida, when it gets dry here and we don't have rain, we are pretty much of a subtropic climate on the southern half of the state. When it gets dry, all this palmettos and everything get so dry they're just unbelievable tender, and it doesn't take much. We're the lightning capital of the world here. Doesn't take much to get a fire going, so they will deliberately burn the wilderness areas and deliberately burn it so that the brush isn't as thick. And it's amazing the new growth that pops up almost overnight, and it actually replenishes the soil and everything else. It's a positive thing in that respect. So you're paralleling that with the storms too.
Sure, and even like when Yellowstone burned, Yellowstone is coming back. So even though you have these forest fires, the land changes, but then it comes back, it regrows again, and that's the same with hurricanes from the studies that I've seen anyway.
So we've got a situation in the Gulf because of no hurricanes last year where the water is even more stagnant, less oxygen than naturally would be. If we had the same thing this year, I guess we could just call it a big stagnant pond, because without oxygen, life isn't going to work, and the oil is still flowing. That's part of the problem too. So there's another cause for less oxygen. We've got at the least chemicals being added to that, and as I'm a proponent of, and apparently the lone voice, we've got some bioremediation to add to it. That's synthetic genomics involved, and that's out of hand. So it doesn't look good for the Gulf of Mexico right now. And the weather warfare, I stick with that term. Modifying it sounds too nice. It's weather warfare, and who knows who's doing what manipulation. I would think that BP has got to be involved with trying to make sure that hurricanes don't come into the Gulf, because it's going to stir up the mess that they've created. But
I would agree with that it's going to stir it up, and they don't want it stirred up.
But here they've just given BP and other oil companies new leases for the Gulf of Mexico to start drilling more. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. I just my mind gets boggled. Nothing seems to make sense of what's going on with the Gulf of Mexico here. Regulations aren't followed that actually do exist, and it's not just BP. It's other oil companies as well. The Gulf, just like the Atlantic, just like the Pacific, I did an article on this, and I noticed that you had an article posted as well about all the World War I and even some early World War II chemical warfare, biological warfare weapons that were just dumped in the oceans. And that factor in there too, perhaps they were drilling when BP was drilling on their exploratory wells. Maybe they ran into some of the unmarked canisters of the bad gas that was dumped there, since the military doesn't seem to have accurate records of where it was all dumped. We only have some areas we know about that.
Well, there's a report. I don't know if you know, but I put it on my website. I can send it to you so you don't have to go through 10,000 things. But there's a report by NOAA that maps out these areas where they were dumped. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration does know where a lot of this is lying on the floor of the ocean in the Gulf. They do know where it is. And what concerns me is that, in other words, we're about to shake it up and expose that to environmental hazards when we start 5-year U.S. Navy warfare testing program there.
Well, that's where I was getting to mention about all this. The lewisite gas that they had dumped in the Gulf, I researched that along with Lynn, And we found out that a lot of it was dumped in NOAA, and neither the military gave the locations of where it was dumped in the Gulf. So what is lewisite? Lewisite is arsenic and acetylene. And that was also dumped in the Atlantic off the coast of Florida and dumped off the California coast as well. We looked into that. NOAA does not know where all of it is, and the military either is not telling or has faulty records. But let's move on now to the Navy with their 5-year warfare deal. How is that going to test with this warfare testing? Explain what kind of tests they're going to do. Has this started yet in the Gulf of Mexico, and what can we expect?
Well, I did send you the link to the U.S. Navy final environmental impact statement, which is there, which is probably in its final form almost a foot high, small writing on 2 sides of each page. But there's 16 of these 5-year warfare testing programs in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Gulf of Mexico, each one being approved since 2008. And so I have the one just for Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho in a hard copy, and it sits here, and it's more than a foot high. And I can summarize what's in your program. I've kind of I went through it quickly today to look at it, and it's very similar in the impact that it's going to have with ours, except that your marine mammals are a little different than the ones that we have here in Northern California. But the program is going to involve a horrible situation in which they're going to do sonar testing, electromagnetic weapons testing. They're going to be doing missile exercises. The scope and range of the exercises are stunning. They're going to be dropping 5,000-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs. Most of their exercises will be live fire exercises. So you're going to find that they're going to do anti-submarine warfare training and tracking exercises. They're going to be doing missile exercises, gunnery exercises, bombing exercises, sinking exercise, and mine warfare training, most of which is redundant to the 16 other 5-year warfare testing programs that are planned for all around the entire United States and all of its island areas.
Great.
And so what happens is they're going to be using toxic chemicals, aluminum-coated fiberglass, red phosphorus. They're going to be using lead chloride, chromium, benzene, toluene, naphthalene, ammonium perchlorate, and then the list of chemicals goes on. There's around 250 alone that are going to be used just in our range, which encompasses Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And there's going to be overland exercises, drone exercises, sonic booms, electromagnetic weapons testing, which has started off the California coast here, using lasers, the HEL laser. They just conducted an experiment last week here, and we could smell the burning from that laser program.
Rosalind, we're at the top of the hour here. Let's take a quick break because I really want you to get into detail on this and not rush it. So let's take our break. It'll be about 5 minutes. Go grab a glass of ice water or whatever you need to wet your whistle. You've been doing a lot of talking, so I'm just going to don't hang up or anything like that. We're just going to take a quick break, and we'll get back here. And please go into detail with that when we get back. I'd love to know what kind of chemicals are used, what's involved with all this. How is it going to affect us here in the Gulf, even with you there in California, and more so this laser stuff because your links on that really amazed me. So I do want to get into that more. We're taking a short break. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Stay with us. We have Rosalind Peterson talking about weather modification, and she's about to get into the Navy 5-year warfare testing program, how that will affect us as well. So don't go away. Hang in there. We'll be back in about 5 minutes.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Well, we're back here for the second hour, Gulf of Mexico update. I'm your host, Michael Edward. Thank you for listening. We have fantastic guests on today. And continuing through with our second hour, Rosalind Peterson, talking about weather modification here in the Gulf of Mexico and actually all around North America and even the world. A subject that a lot of people don't know about. Most people, the great majority, have no idea of some of the things that are being done with weather manipulation, basically controlling our lives. And we were just starting to get into, right before our break, about the Navy 5-year warfare testing program. And this might not seem that it applies with weather modification, especially with the Gulf of Mexico, but it really does because of what's involved with this warfare testing program with the Navy. So I'm going to let Rosalind get back on here, and she's back with us now. And let's get into that further, Rosalind. Especially go back to this laser testing and what kind of implications does that have?
Well, the Navy has been working for a long time, along with the other branches of the military service, on having a laser where they can shoot something down, an airplane, or they can shoot a boat, or they can blind someone with lasers. And they've begun to now perfect it, and they've done land tests before. Now, off the coast of California, they set a boat on fire. And if anyone wants to see some of their experiments, they can go to my website. It's agriculturedefensecoalition.org. If they go to the U.S. Navy section, and if you scroll down all the way to the very bottom of the page, you will find two videos, the last two videos, which I just put up, one of which was a Navy video. They put this out for us to look at, by the way. It was a Navy video of one of the tests, and then there was the Navy video of the one they conducted off the coast of California last week, in which they set a boat afire using a laser. And
I
so
saw that video.
this is their film, so it's not mine.
I saw that on your site. Thanks for sending that link. Just so that people don't get confused of where to find everything with you, we turn around and put your background and your major site links on our main site, our forum. So let me just get that to people who are not in our chat so they can go and look at all this so you don't have to constantly repeat, and I don't have to do the same of where your sites are found. So go to worldvisionportal.org. That's worldvisionportal.org. When you get in the board index, go into WVP Media, and then go into WVP Radio, and you'll see our forum about Rosalind Peterson, who's on with us now, weather modification in the Gulf of Mexico. And we've got all your sites on there, Rosalind, so people can find you. If you're in the chat, you've already got them all there. So this is for everybody who's not live with us in the chat. So, I saw that video from the Navy with the laser with the 200 horsepower outboard motor. That just, that was amazing. I knew the technology was there. I never got to see it before. So, okay, what's the implications? How does this affect us? What other kinds of things besides the laser? But I think there's some, emissions or something that come from using the laser that modifies or creates certain gases or something. Explain what that's about.
Yes, the technology that they use for lasers, especially their chemical lasers, the gases are highly toxic. And also during the use of lasers, it creates toxic gases, and they're going to be doing experiments to make them safer. But on the other hand, just the burning of the boat and the gas containers or whatever those containers were on the boat that they set afire means that we are going to be suffering from the air pollution from these bomb blasts and these other tests. And this will blow, for example, directly on us from the Pacific Ocean. So we're going to have airborne chemicals, we're going to have particles, we're going to have all kinds of, in other words, problems. But anyone can go to my website, and I want to kind of say one thing. If they go to the PDF section, which starts with 17K, they will find a map of the Gulf of Mexico where the warfare testing ranges are in the entire Gulf. It's called the GOMEX, G-O-M-E-X, range complex, and that's just one of the 16. But you can get an idea of that this range complex is going to be along the borders of most of the southern Gulf of Mexico states. And so this isn't just going to be, this is special use airspace. There's land ranges. There's going to be overland activities as well as bomb blasts. The U.S. Air Force is going to be bombing and wants permission from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to bomb in some areas where the manatees have their ranges.
Oh,
and I'm thinking that these bomb blasts, especially when you're talking about above the ocean and also under the ocean, they could disturb these oil wells that are there that are capped. They could crack them so they start leaking. They could cause more fissures in that area, so you could have more gas leaks from fissures. They, when you have oil wells that are operating, it could cause cracking and other damage to them from these type of blasts and experiments that they're going to be doing. So I'm concerned that the people of the Gulf of Mexico are going to have additional dangers and exposures from not only the toxic chemicals, but the bomb blasts themselves. And also, the military doesn't like to tell the people in the Gulf of Mexico where they're practicing, which means your fishermen could be at risk, tourists could be at risk in those areas. It also means that when you talked about those chemicals that were dumped from World War II and other wars into the Gulf of Mexico, it could disturb them and crack those fragile containers that are probably rusting by now.
Yep.
So I look at this as, in other words, we already have one disaster. Why does the Navy need to practice in the Atlantic, in the Gulf of Mexico? I mean, they're practicing in almost the entire coastal region of Washington, Oregon, almost all of California. They're going to have another range in Alaska. They're practicing in Hawaii, the Marianas Islands in the Pacific. And then when you look at this map, you've got all of these ranges along the Atlantic seaboard. And then you've got all these other range complex and island areas out in the Pacific as well. Just how many places does the Navy need to practice in the Air Force? Do they need to practice? That's the question.
That's a big question. Why?
Now, I'm going to read one brief item here. This was a letter written by 7 senators. This was written by Senator Barbara Boxer, Olympia Snowe, Ron Wyden of Oregon, Dianne Feinstein, Maria Cantwell, Sheldon Whitehouse, and Jeff Merkley. And this letter is important for one reason. It's a June 19, 2009 letter, and it states, in many regions, the Navy plans to increase the number of its exercises or expand the areas in which they may occur, and virtually every coastal state will be affected. Some exercises may occur in the nation's most biologically sensitive marine habitats, including national marine sanctuaries and breeding habitats for the endangered North Atlantic right whale. In all, the Navy anticipates more than 2.3 million takes, significant disruptions in marine mammal foraging, breeding, and other essential behaviors per year, or 11.7 million takes over the course of a 5-year permit. And the definition of a take is to harass, hunt, kill, torture, harm, pursue, wound, or collect or attempt to engage in any such conduct. And so that's why they need permission from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The Navy needs permission in order to harm these marine mammals. And in your environmental impact statement, it will give the number and types of marine mammals that will be impacted by these programs and these bomb blasts and missile exercises and sonar use. And it is unlikely that any national marine sanctuary or biological habitat will be spared from Navy activities and exercises because they refuse to do it along the California, Oregon, and Washington coast.
And you had said earlier, even the Air Force is involved with part of this. It's not just Navy. This is more of a military warfare testing where other branches besides the Navy will be involved in coordination with the Navy, I'm sure. Let me ask a question. You're familiar with HAARP and electromagnetic and scalar technologies. Do you think this is being used not only in this testing, but even in the weather modification, specifically in the Gulf? Do you think that's involved with what's going on? Because that's what a lot of people are saying. Do you know anything about that as to whether it is or isn't?
I'm not an expert in HAARP, and I don't have any documentations which would, any documents or anything credible that I would be able to put on the air or on my website where I would be able to verify or back up that information.
Okay, well, it was a question that I had, but also somebody in our chat. So I told you I would ask the questions that come along. So I appreciate your honesty, and it's obviously not what you've been studying. You've been not just studying. You've been documenting so much with the things that without a doubt are being used. Let's go back to this warfare testing with the Navy and probably in coordination with the Air Force and such. What are some of these weapons they're testing? You started reading some of that before we took our break. If you could go back to that list so people can understand, here are the weapons that are being tested, and then if you know any of the repercussions of these particular weapons testings, if you could give us a rundown on that as much as you know, I'd appreciate it because I want to know what's going on. Okay.
In the GOMEX hazardous materials section, and this is GOMEX is in your area, and this includes air, land, and offshore areas of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Okay, so I want to make sure that we know the range we're talking about here. Okay, now, in your, there's a statement called hazardous materials, and there's graphs in this section, and it lists the number of activities or training items expended annually or alternatives, and it gives you kind of, in other words, whether they include heavy metals, chemicals, explosives, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite a big graph, but they talk about tactical air and launch decoy. It's TALD, and they don't recover it. It stays in the oceans, and it has heavy metal concentrations. Okay, you've got the Sparrow missiles, and they give you, it's got heavy metals, chemicals, explosives, and they tell you the number of them that they're going to expend annually. They've got the AMRAAM missile. They've got the Sea Sparrow missile. It's a NATO Sea Sparrow missile. They've got the MK-82. It's a live bomb, 500-pound bomb. Let's see. This has got chemicals and explosives in it. They've got the, let me see, the MK-82 live bomb, 500-pound bomb. The MK-83 is a 1,000-pound bomb. They list the AGM-88 HARM missile, the AGM-114 Hellfire missile, the AGM Maverick missile, the AGM-84 Harpoon missile, the SLAM-ER missile, the MK-ADCAP torpedo, and then they list the number. All of them have chemicals in their makeup. All of them have explosives, and most of them listed here have heavy metals.
Yeah, we've got
just a few of them. I mean, I could go on because, let me see, there's
sure.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 pages of this. I don't think you want me to read all 6 pages.
No, I think we're getting the idea that this doesn't make sense, Rosalind. And the reason I'm saying that is we're involved, whether we like it or not, we're involved in the Middle East, and we're having all our weapons there, and I don't understand. Why do we have to go test this in the Gulf of Mexico when we've got battlefields that we're live firing and doing the same thing right now? This doesn't make sense to me. Sonar. That was one of the things in some of the links that you sent me.
Yes.
The sonar testing. Explain, what's that about, and does that affect the sea life?
Yes, we believe, and Dr. Jane Lubchenco admitted that they don't know all the effects of sonar, but that it does have impacts, and there's many questions about it. And she was here in our town, and we have her the transcript of what she had to say when she was here last December. But in talking about this, and yet she went ahead and approved the Navy using sonar during our gray whale migration and the salmon runs and everything else, and refused to protect a single biological breeding habitat or national marine sanctuary, even when they knew that they were going to use experimental weapons and they didn't know what harm those would cause. There's new types of lasers now just coming out that are much more potentially harmful to marine mammals than what we've used in the past. And all of these there's 16 of these 5-year warfare testing programs, of which the Gulf of Mexico includes just one of the 16. And when you read the environmental impact statements, most of them are redundant. They're testing the same missiles. They're testing the same sonar. They're testing the same everything. And we don't feel that the Navy needs to practice on every island area, which they intend, and along every coastal community in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, and the Gulf of Mexico. And we feel that in the Gulf of Mexico, this disaster could be absolutely awful, considering your oil spill, considering the hazard materials already there, considering that their explosions could disturb and cause fissures in that area and cause oil leaks at the platforms that are either capped off or will be active or are active in those areas. Plus, the fishing industry will be exposed to toxic chemical pollution from the Navy warfare testing. They're going to be exposing the fish and the marine mammals and all life to these bomb blasts, which are going to destroy, admittedly, biologically sensitive habitats and breeding grounds.
Wonderful. As if we don't have enough to deal with in the Gulf of Mexico already. We have to add this on top of it over the next 5 years. I can't remember. Did you say that this has already begun? Is this 5-year program with the Navy on the warfare testing? Is this? I know it's already approved. Has it actually gone into implementation at this point?
NOAA, as far as I know, has not issued the letter of authorization. But the final environmental impact statement and the record of decision by the Navy, that has all been finalized. There's no public comment left. The only pressure that could be applied would be against NOAA not approving these testing in all areas and preserving some of the manatee habitat, preserving at least some of your biologically sensitive areas, or preserving your national marine sanctuaries and other areas in that area, or stopping sonar use during the whale migrations there. But the Navy so far has been given carte blanche and can do whatever they want, because NOAA is not an oversight agency. It's a what they call a cooperating agency.
Well, we're familiar with their cooperation here in the Gulf.
Do you know if any of your elected officials where you are know about this program even, or were told about it?
To me, this is all news. I really did not know about the Navy 5-year warfare testing program at all. Not until you sent the links yesterday and earlier today for me to look over. This is all news to me, so I have not heard of it before. Can I go back real quick? The sonar.
Sure.
How does this affect? I've known that previous tests with sonar in the Atlantic have created, and in the Caribbean too, because down out not too far off Dominican Republic, U.S. Navy was conducting sonar tests, and there were a bunch of dead dolphins and whales came up. That was years ago. I'm sure the newer sonar is even more dangerous, but explain to people what does sonar do to mammals like whales and dolphins?
Well, it emits sound, okay? And when it emits sounds, it emits these sounds in pitches that harm the hearing, can even make dolphins, for example, deaf, where they can't hear. And you see, they navigate, these marine mammals navigate by hearing and echo registering. And when you destroy their hearing, or you make the tones so intense, they get out of the area, but it can damage them and cause them to breach or try to get out of the water because they can't stand the sounds. And so sonar at different frequencies, low, medium, and high range frequencies, and the new laser type sonar, which we don't know the impacts with, have this tremendous sounds that can in other words, it's like I put you in, have you ever had one of those devices go off that are fire devices that when you hit smoke alarms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, one of those things go off. Have you ever had it? You can hardly stand to be in the room to get it turned off.
Oh, yes.
They're so noisy. Well, it's something like putting you in a room with all these fire alarms going off and then telling you without any ear cover that you've got to turn them all off while they're shrieking. I mean, the only thing you want to do is get out of the room, much less turn one of those things off.
Sure. So in other words, making a living hell for every mammal in the Gulf or wherever they do these sonar tests.
That's right. And there's on the website, I'm sorry to mention it again, but on the website there's...
keep mentioning. I just want to make sure everybody knew that we had it on there in case they're not in our chat live here. But please go ahead and mention where they can find this while you're talking.
On the U.S. Navy section, we put up some video about the effects of marine mammals and sonar on marine mammals and some other things so that people can look at some short videos and clips on there as well. And the NRDC has a really great movie that goes into this and the damaging effects of this. So we know that there's effects, but you see, the thing is that our Navy should be protecting our natural resources. It should be protecting our food supply. Our Navy should be engaged in not doing anything that would harm our oceans, harm the public along the oceans, or destroy the breeding and feeding habitat in all of our ocean areas. In other words, it's not just the Gulf of Mexico, it's everywhere. And so our Navy should be in a protection mode, and they don't need to practice with live fire weapons and drop 5,000-pound bombs just to see what happens. We already know we've dropped enough, we've shot off enough Hellfire missiles in a couple of wars in the last 10, 12 years. We have shot off all these missiles that I named. We know exactly what their capabilities are. Why are we using them as live fire to destroy an ocean? If they want to practice, they can use duds. This is ridiculous.
Well, yeah, considering they've already we've already got a destruction in the Gulf of Mexico, biologically, chemically. We got a mess because it's not an oil spill; it's an oil flow. That's bad enough. Now we're going to have to deal with this 5-year warfare testing program, which you explained is, there's no more hearings on it. Which my question was, gee, we know how these weapons work already. What do we need to turn around and do it in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic and in the Pacific Ocean? We're already in skirmishes and so-called wars already. We're already using this. So what's the sense? Why do we have to have this 5-year program to go test it some more? Like you said, here's a big thing that you brought up that people don't realize. If this 5-year program is going to happen in the Gulf of Mexico, I don't know if you're aware of how many pipelines exist along the floor of the Gulf of Mexico going to shore, to refineries and offshore collection points for ships to download and such. They're all leaking already. We've already got a problem with that. Leaking pipelines everywhere. We have capped wells leaking like crazy. The Gulf in the past 20 years has already had a problem, but then almost a year ago, we end up with a BP problem. I can't imagine that they're going to put 500 and 1,000-pound bombs and pop them off in the Gulf of Mexico and see what happens when we already have a fragile pipeline system for gas and crude oil, and fragile, as you said, fractures will occur more. We've already drilled too much, and now they're giving out, right before this testing is about to start, they're handing out more leases for deep water exploratory wells. This doesn't make sense. I wish somebody could make sense of it for me, but it doesn't make any sense. It's crazy.
It doesn't make any sense. And what I want to say to you, though, is that these programs can always be sidetracked or stopped. There's no reason that we have to go through with them or the Navy has to go through with them. It's a case of where the Navy has very carefully orchestrated that there would be very little notification, if any, in any newspapers that, for example, I talked with the mayor, the Plaquemine Parish, Billy
Nunsinger.
Yes, and I asked his staff person if he knew about this 5-year Navy warfare testing program that was about to begin that would impact his area. And he said no. This was late last year, December. He said no. And
wow.
I said, have you seen the EIS? Have you seen this? I sent it to them. I don't know what they know about it now, but you're right. It's going to disrupt and crack more pipelines in there. I don't know how many there are. I don't have any idea because you're on the total other side of the United States, and I don't know as much about the Gulf except what I learned since what I learned since this Gulf oil spill. But I really believe that a stop could be put on this right away if people understood the consequences of this and the implications of this, even to the drilling programs.
Sure.
I don't think the right hand knows what the left hand is doing in all of this. And I think that this was implemented and that most people when I tell them that there's been an ongoing program in Southern California for over a year, people are shocked. But they can hear the bomb blasts going out on the ocean. If you live close enough, you can hear the airplanes going over the bomb blasts, and the same in Oregon where they've implemented this. People can see the increased flights and all these goings-on that are happening there, and the consequences of, in other words, starving animals and different things are going to be showing up now that they've expanded into Northern California, Oregon, and Idaho and Washington. And these are over land plans and experiments. And we're even having private companies who are going to do drone surveillance over us now. We're contracting out with these companies to surveil us and do this drone testing over us. And I looked at this and I thought, well, I don't really want to be the guinea pig for these things either.
Agreed. I'm there with you. Okay.
I'm sorry all this is such bad news. I mean, I would rather have talked about some wonderful things rather than this topic, but when I was contacted and they said, well, we're going to talk about the Gulf of Mexico, and I thought, well, we have to talk about the Navy, so I'm sorry to bring this subject up.
No, don't be sorry. You know, people have to be aware. I'm one of those. I hate to talk about what my research has been and talk about the Gulf Blue Plague. Nothing really depresses me worse than knowing how many hundreds of thousands and most likely million or millions will die because of them introducing synthetic biology through microorganisms into the Gulf to eat up their big mistake called oil. No, it's not pleasant to talk about it, but I'm one of those, and a lot of people that I know, I can deal with something when I know what it is that I have to deal with. And that's why I feel people have to know, yes, it's doom and gloom, what you just spoke about. It's terrible. But a lot of people have got to know what they're going to face so that they can deal with it. So don't apologize for, saying this is all terrible news. Let's get back to hurricanes and weather modification, manipulation, however we're going to call it. I'm going to ask you a loaded question, and I'm going to put you on the spot. I am not asking you a prediction. I just would like your opinion. What do you think, your own opinion, based on all the research and all the knowledge that you have over the years with weather modification and manipulation and the geoengineering, what do you think is going to happen this upcoming season in the Gulf of Mexico for hurricanes? Could you take any wild guesses?
I'm going to guess, based on what I know, that a hurricane may not make landfall in the Gulf of Mexico this year. I have a hunch it won't. In other words, the way we're modifying the weather across the United States, we're practicing with fronts moving across the United States, pushing off hurricanes, with Bill Gates and NASA and NOAA and all these agencies and private companies working on different weather modification schemes and plans. I think that they're going to continue to implement those experiments.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you 100%. I just want to hear somebody else say it. You've got
it's a guess. I mean, I have to be honest with you. This is a guess, but from looking at the past history over the last few years, I think it's a pretty good guess.
Is there anything that we haven't discussed with weather manipulation? I mean, we know that the corporations that are involved, there's companies that actually do this, governments do it, even down to a local level, all across North America. Have we missed something? There's something that we haven't spoken about that you think is really needs to be brought up when it comes to weather manipulation, and not just in the Gulf, but anywhere. We all know about Bill Gates. Has he got that patent yet?
Well, I think he's applied for it. I don't know if he has it, but I know that there's an patent pending application. Yeah. And I know that universities and all kinds of people are obtaining patents so that they can use different chemicals, they can do different types of experiment. And so I think that weather modification is going to escalate across the United States. But here's the rub. We talk about, we have to do something about global warming. And so we have to add particles and chemicals into the atmosphere to reduce the amount of sunlight. We're talking about all these experiments using our upper atmosphere as an experimental laboratory for the military, for weather modification for all kinds of experiments. And to say that, well, in other words, the weather and all these weird changes in the weather are just due to global warming is nuts, because we know and can identify many of these experiments. I mean, we have the university studies, we have the documents, we have the admissions from our government agencies that they're ongoing. So my question is, to say that we're going to fix, in other words, that we're going to stop global warming so that our weather gets normal, that's not even possible because we're doing all these experiments.
That's a valid point. Very valid. Yeah, it doesn't seem to make sense, does it? It's just hard to try to put the picture together because it doesn't make sense why that picture should be created that way with a weather modification unless it's all about control. Is it control military? Well, apparently so. The military wants to own the weather. Whether it's 2025, I always thought that was kind of a joke when they first came out with that because I figured they'd want to have it all under control by 2010. So it looks like maybe they might have accomplished that goal. Other things with weather modification that affect us with our crops is something that you have really studied and gotten into. People aren't aware of those effects. They just think, oh, Mother Nature dealt us a bad hand in cards. But that's not the truth. And, you know, this is even an agricultural warfare in a way from what you've been describing. And this is your forte right here because this is what you study the most. What do you think we can expect if we're going to have another repeat no hurricane Gulf of Mexico season? Now, Florida is a big part of the breadbasket for North America and exports even, and not just fruit, but tomatoes, things like that. We grow a lot of food here. How would you guess that another repeat no hurricane season, how do you think that can affect Florida when it comes to the food that's produced here?
Well, I think that the weather modification programs ongoing across the United States are already having their impact on Florida. You've had unusual freezes, you've had unusual weather patterns and systems coming through Florida already, which has reduced the food production there. We get, I can tell you just the orange crop. See, usually California oranges are shipped back east and out of the country, and the oranges that are produced in Florida are the ones that show up on our supermarket shelves.
Yeah,
so when
don't
people
believe
come to
that.
California thinking they're going to get California oranges, they usually get oranges from Florida.
That's true. I know about that.
So
and even
what
in
happens
Texas.
is that we've had a little bit more of California produce showing up because there's not so much coming in from Florida. And I think that it's going to be devastating. This weather modification is going to be devastating. But I do want to say something else. I'll break some news that you probably don't know. We can now bet on the weather through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Starting a couple of years ago, they decided that you could bet on the weather in your locality or your area, and you could bet whether it was going to rain or snow or be good weather, and you can bet on ag produce and whether there's going to be a good crop or a bad crop based on whether you can. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange started to allow betting on the weather in futures markets. Now, here's the rub. Just in the last 3 months, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange says, well, you can also bet on the amount of rain or the amount of snow that will fall in a certain area. And I thought to myself, and they said, well, there's no possible way anybody could have insider trading on the weather. However, every weather modification company that's modifying the weather in a certain area knows exactly where they're going to enhance the rain, enhance the snowfall, create a drought, dissipate clouds, any private company, any private corporation now can hire a company for, so many $1,000s, have them increase the snowpack in some mountain range somewhere, and bet on the Chicago Exchange. You can go to my website, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has a listing of some of the weather modification programs ongoing, 66 of them actually, to be quite correct, which will tell you the month of the program, where the program is located, how many pounds of chemicals are going to be used, what months the programs take place, and what location, and who's doing the weather modification and who hired them to do the weather modification. Now, all I have to do is take that data, go down and bet on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange that there's going to be more snow in the Wyoming mountains in this county during this time period. I can bet on snowfall. I can bet on the rainfall. I can bet on fog dissipation. I can bet on anything now. And these programs and these weather modification companies and private individuals are going to increase what they're doing because they can make a fortune betting on the stock market on this.
Wow. So here we have the financial connection of weather manipulation. It's not really a bet. You said that you can bet on it. It's not really even a bet. You just explained that they can go to the company and get the data that has been paid to modify the weather in this particular place and turn around and that really truly is insider information, and yet go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and know that they've got a sure deal and make millions of dollars off of their inside knowledge. That's amazing.
It's not even
using
inside
weather
knowledge,
to make money.
it's public knowledge, because for example, the Texas Weather Modification Regulation Department lists all the weather modification programs. I mean, it's public record. They put it, and you can go to their meetings and sit there, and then all you have to do is go down and say, well, they're going to increase the rainfall over here during these months and bet on it. It's public record that we're doing these programs. It's not, that's the problem. It's not hidden.
I have to laugh because I can imagine. I just had this vision. Okay, here BP or whoever. I didn't mean to specify them, but they're a good candidate. Whoever is going to make sure we don't have hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico again this year. Mm-hmm. All those people who are in that company or whatever, or with that government agency, they already know the company or the military is going to stop the hurricanes. So they can make themselves millionaires or perhaps even billionaires going to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and already knowing that there won't be a hurricane come into the Gulf of Mexico this coming hurricane season based on true data and contracts that have already been handed out. That's in a way it's hard to believe, but in a way it makes so much sense. So we can have some new billionaires this year betting on the Gulf of Mexico not having a hurricane.
Or you can bet that there's going to be snow in the Wyoming mountains there's going to be more snow in the Wyoming mountains between this date and this date, because we know that there's a 5-state program that's modifying the weather to do that.
Boy, the world has gotten pretty weird. That's all I can say.
But see, what the scary part of this is that people could actually hire these companies to make some weather event just so that they could financially benefit, and there's no law against it.
And I'm sure that's exactly what's going on. That's too much of a temptation for them not to make that bet.
Yes, and see, the last 2 years when they've opened this up for first betting on the weather and futures markets and all this at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and now all of a sudden in the last few months, they said, well, now you can bet on rainfall totals and snow totals and all this. Well, somebody figured out right away that we have an inside track.
That's just amazing. Wow, that's an
But look
amazing
who's
way to
going
end
to
the show
suffer.
here.
But you see, we're going to suffer as a people on this only because it's going to impact agriculture, crop production. It's going to impact the watersheds in some areas. It's going to create droughts. It's going to create adverse weather conditions, and people are going to suffer from those adverse weather conditions. And you see, we're going to pay the eventual price in higher food costs and putting people out of business who are in agricultural fields. We're already paying the price. And the United States, for example, used to be, in other words, a net importer or net exporter of food.
Mm-hmm.
And in past years, we were the breadbasket for a lot of other countries. Now, we, in the last 3 years, have turned into a net importer of food because we can no longer supply enough food to feed the people of the United States within our borders. We no longer have excess food to ship out. And the problem with that is that we're becoming dependent, just like when they say dependent on foreign oil, we're becoming dependent on foreign supplies for food. Food that's grown in toxic soils, food that's grown with pesticides and herbicides that we've banned, and we're going to be more and more dependent as we modify the weather in the United States and destroy our own base.
Wonderful. Yeah, and it just didn't happen overnight. It's been planned and has been coming down the pike for a while. This has been very educational and eye-opening 2 hours, Rosalind. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to let me and let all our listeners know what's going on with weather modification, how it's at least going to affect us here. That's mostly what this show is about, Gulf of Mexico update, as if we're not facing enough already. But I've been curious to have somebody who's really studied it really well. I predicted last year that just because of the flowing oil that they couldn't allow a hurricane to come in there, and it ends up my prediction was right. And I based it simply on the fact that the oil couldn't be blown around. They were trying to hide it, or as we found out, they were trying to have it all gobbled up with bacteria. Your opinion and your side of this from your research is different than my wild guess because of oil. You've got some amazing articles on your site. I just want to make sure that everybody's got that again, because most of our listeners download as an archive. So Rosalind Peterson, go to her two main sites, Agriculture Defense Coalition. .org, and that's where you're really going to find a lot of stuff, more articles than you could read in a year. Amazing. And her other site where you started the California Skywatch.com. That was your first site, and it kind of got overloaded, right?
Well, it got overloaded, but I updated it about a year ago, and now the database for both websites are interactive. So sometimes you'll click on something on Skywatch, it'll take you to the ADC, and sometimes vice versa. So the two websites now are interactive with the same database, and there are a little bit different topics on the two websites, but they're interactive in between because a lot of subjects overlap.
I hear you. In fact, I noticed that when I was going back and forth. Yeah, you've got about a minute. How do you want to end this? What's your conclusion with what's going to happen this year with our weather modification all throughout North America?
Well, what I want to say is that we have choices about whether we want weather modification programs to continue. We have choices about whether the Navy continues its testing. We can say no to some of these things. And part of the reason I put the information up is I want people to know, and I also want people to know that we can make a difference. But part of it is getting educated on these subjects. And I want to thank you ever so much for inviting me to be on your show today. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here with you. And I want to thank you for putting this information out to the public so that people will know what's going on and can understand more of what's happening in the environment around them and how it impacts them.
Well, that's what it's all about. Try to get the truth out there. So I do appreciate you taking the time, 2 hours. It's not the way most people want to spend their Friday afternoon, but thank you for educating me, educating our listeners, and teaching me a lot today about what's really going on and especially how it affects in so many different areas. So I like to be informed, and that's why I'm very glad that I was told that you could be a guest and couldn't wait. So thank you again, Rosalind. Beyond informative, just absolutely fantastic. And you have an invitation to spend at least an hour or another 2 hours with us again in the future. So I hope you'll accept that invitation and bring us up to date.
I would love to, and if I have any special information that comes up, I'll definitely send it to you.
Excellent. Okay, we're just about out of time. You heard 2 hours with Rosalind Peterson. She's out in California. She was talking about weather modification and especially about the Gulf, but everywhere else. Definitely go to her sites, CaliforniaSkywatch.com, Agriculture Defense Coalition.org. It was just a fantastic show. Rosalind, thank you again so much. We've all just been taught a lot. So, like I end every show, make sure that you become who you were created to be. Catch you next week.
Welcome to the Gulf of Mexico Blue Plague Update with Living Light Network host Michael Edward, who reminds us all, wherever the Gulf wind blows and the Gulf water flows. And here's Michael with the latest Gulf update.
Well, thank you, Bill. That's our announcer, Bill. We moved over. If you haven't noticed, we're on a different channel on Blog Talk Radio. We're at Living Light Network. Just moving everything to the way it should be. All our archives are sitting back there on our old site. And if you had gone there on Blog Talk Radio, that's blogtalkradio.com/WVP is our old site. And all our archives are there, previous shows. They will stay there. But for clarity, we wanted to turn around and have a new channel with the name of our network, so that there wasn't any confusion any longer. So we're over here at blogtalkradio.com/Living Light Network. So this is our new home. The call-in number has changed. It's now 424-258-9302. And as I found out, my host PIN number and other things had changed. This is our first show on the new channel here at Blog Talk Radio. So I apologize for the delay of a little bit over a minute to get this show started, but we got it all worked out. We have a fantastic guest today. I've spent a good couple hours just trying to go over some of the things on her internet sites, and it's just mind-boggling. Our guest is Rosalind Peterson, and she's out from California. Her two internet sites, I don't think I've ever seen more articles referencing more different things. You want to talk about a library of information. You have to go to her sites. Her two main sites are agriculturedefensecoalition.org, and her second site, just as profound, is CaliforniaSkywatch.com. So much information there, you'll almost get lost. I did, and she had forwarded some things for me to try to go over before the show today, and I was just overwhelmed. So I just want to remind everybody, if you're in the chat, you'll see Lynn posting up the links to her main sites. I'll give them to you again for those who are listening in archives of this show. CaliforniaSkywatch.com, AgricultureDefenseCoalition.org. She's also got her articles in News with Views under her heading Peterson, Rosalind Peterson. You can find it there. Just look her up. She's been putting a lot of information about weather modification and such. And I wanted her on the show because there's obviously a lot of weather modification that has been going on, especially since last year with the Gulf, when all of a sudden no hurricanes showed up.
So some of these plans are still continuing, even though they're having adverse effects. And one of the things that would happen if they did ocean iron fertilization in the Gulf of Mexico would be to create these artificial algae blooms. And then once you have these blooms, it cuts off oxygen to the plant life there when it starts to decay. And so then you can have the death of, in other words, fish and other things that depend on this ocean and the oxygen in the ocean. So there's a number of things that can happen during the course of ocean iron fertilization. The other plans are to have what they call global geoengineering governance, in which we experiment releasing toxic chemicals or gases like sulfur into the atmosphere to put up particles that reflect the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. But when you do this, you change the weather, the ocean weather and the land weather, because you're reducing the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. And you're also then starting other problems, like you're going to have more acid rains, more tree decline, more water and air pollution. Or another geoengineering project, as another example, is to put salt particulates into clouds in order to whiten them and make them more reflective. The only problem is that when these salt particulates rain out, and they rain out more quickly than other types of particulates, they could rain out over your water supply, your soils, your watersheds, forest lands, and you could deliberately impair the soil and the ability of soil to produce crops.
So they're using, you said, salt particulates, and is this what I saw on your site called the whitening of clouds, cloud whitening?
Yes, one of the experiments that Bill Gates is paying for is to whiten clouds and to see if they can be more reflective so that less sunlight reaches the Earth. And this is supposed to cool us down, but I think it's going to have a negative effect. And also, when you start to reflect direct sunlight back away from the Earth, then we're going to lose photosynthesis, which is required for all ocean plants and all, in other words, crops and trees and everything to grow strong and healthy. You begin to not have so much photosynthesis taking place where plants absorb the energy directly from the sun to grow strong and healthy and produce crops.
Well, are they doing this now? Is this something that's being done, or is it just experimental at this point?
It's experimental at this point, not widely experimental, but the U.S. House Science and Technology Committee and the UK Parliament are in negotiations about setting up global geoengineering governance, where from their hearings they want to experiment more and more with these programs to help us cool the planet. But you see, the thing is that when you
and to most people, it's all seemed odd. Oh my goodness, how could that happen? But nobody's really answering it, and that's the reason that I feel it's really important with our guests to clue us in today. Rosalind is, as I said, has just got so much information about weather modification, and she's going to talk today about how that applies to the Gulf of Mexico and things like the Navy 5-year warfare plan that will affect a lot of things with the Gulf of Mexico. So we're all going to get updated big time today. We've got a 2-hour show here on our new Blog Talk Radio channel, Living Light Network. So without any further ado, Rosalind, thank you for joining us today. It's really a pleasure.
Well, it's an honor to be here on your show with you today, and thank you very much for having me.
Well, I was told if we wanted to get answers, you were the one. So there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm sure the people in chat are going to be posting questions. And as we go along, even other callers may ask questions. So I will ask you my own and also their questions as well as we go along. And just a reminder that at the top of the hour, after our first hour, we will have a 5-minute break so you can take a slight breather and get a sip of ice water.
Okay, that sounds wonderful.
Okay, well, my first question is, and I know you've got so much on your sites about this whole new subject of weather geoengineering. And I had a couple questions. I'd like you to give us, first of all, a little summary of what the heck is weather geoengineering. And I'd like you to go in after you give us a summary. What's all this with the ocean fertilization, and are they doing this in the Gulf, and how does it affect us? So give us a little rundown. What is weather geoengineering?
Well, let me kind of define geoengineering. What is happening is that programs are now being discussed or have been implemented that would change our atmosphere or our oceans, adding particles, chemicals, gases that are going to make changes supposedly to reverse global warming. But in essence, these particles and chemicals and gases would be added to oceans or released in the upper atmosphere, and they would change the climate. They would reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, or in the case of ocean iron fertilization, would put a dust in the ocean, an iron dust into the ocean, to create artificial algae blooms. And this has been done off the California coast by Climos and Planktos, and other experiments have taken place, and they know now from their testing that it doesn't work, and it has a negative impact on ocean environments. Reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, you're going to negatively impair crop production, you're going to negatively impair the ocean climate, and, in other words, the normal growth and function of direct sunlight hitting the ocean.
Oh, gee, sounds like a great plan. I just wonder how they come up with these things and how they possibly think this is supposed to help. Sometimes it boggles my mind with some of these experiments. Yeah, you opened a Pandora's box because I was reading a lot. I think there were like 20 different articles on your site about Bill Gates and his plan to stop hurricanes and his patent. Apparently, he's got a patent for controlling hurricanes. Could you explain what that's all about?
Well, one of the things that NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NASA, the U.S. Air Force, private corporations, and private individuals like Bill Gates are planning to do is to, and there's some university professors and different ones studying this, but what they wanted to do was figure out how they could control the pattern of hurricanes so they can deflect them from one place to another. And so what they've done is they've started to, Bill Gates has got some patents, and a private corporation called Dynamat is looking at this gel, which is highly toxic to marine life. And if you put it into clouds, what it does is it absorbs the moisture in the clouds and dissipates them. But when this gel falls as this goo onto Earth, then it's toxic to aquatic organisms. So these experiments by private corporations and different individuals and government agencies and the military are trying to control the weather patterns and to control hurricanes. And one of the things that Bill Gates is experimenting with is controlling hurricanes.
Great. Well, I think maybe we saw some of his efforts, or at least military efforts, this last summer. We didn't have a single hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and in fact, the last one that came out of the Southwest Caribbean started to head up towards the Yucatan Peninsula into the Gulf of Mexico and did a U-turn right into Cuba. How does something like that happen? Any ideas?
Yes. MIT professor Emmanuel, about 3 years ago, was suggesting that a fleet of jet airplanes, and this was on the Discovery Channel, so anyone can look up his quotes and directly what he was talking about. It was a program on hurricanes, and what he was saying is that they could use a fleet of jets to put up carbon black or soot into the atmosphere in California and other states and start, and this soot would heat up and create these weather fronts. It's called a perturbation, as they call it, and what they do is it's a disturbance, and as these carbon black particles heat up and move across the United States, they start moving across on the jet stream, but they start escalating in how harsh the weather is as they move. So you're going to have severe weather escalating across the United States. In order to drive the front all the way across the United States, escalating, and then have it drive offshore. In other words, to hit a hurricane about the same time that a hurricane would be starting to come toward the shore, either in the Gulf states or along the Atlantic, and then drive that storm and turn it. Well, from the time of inception of seeing this program, we begin to see the black contrails here, and we begin to see these escalating weather patterns starting to occur about the time that the hurricane season was to begin. And in watching them, weather maps and watching weather channels and different things, we could see these patterns moving across. And when the hurricane was announced, you would see these weather patterns actually coming out and moving the hurricane in one direction or another, or pushing it offshore. And since the introduction of this idea, we haven't had a hurricane hit your area. We've seen them deflected, and we think that this is what's happening.
Yeah, something's deflecting them because total unnatural, typical weather patterns with the hurricanes last year, and even back in 2004. I was one of those who was ground zero with Hurricane Charlie, and we saw it do basically a 90-degree turn and come up the Peace River here in southwest Florida. They had already pretty much evacuated, shut off the electric in Tampa because they said, well, it's going there for sure. Somehow, mysteriously, it just makes this right-hand turn. So to me, that was my first introduction, being right smack in the middle of it, of weather manipulation, and that's why I started to look into it a little bit. But I haven't got a tenth of the information of what you've got. So that's why it was important to me to have you on here. I need to be educated as well because I want to know how they're doing all this. It's something that you had sent me, where you said that the U.S. government or even a state government, their laws, according to those laws, anyone can modify the weather without public consent, which I never knew. So us, the public, Joe Blow, somebody can be modifying the weather without us knowing about it, without our consent, and there's no oversight. Is that still true now?
That is still true to this day. I've talked to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and other government agencies, and there is no law that says that in other words, that there's any controls over anyone who wants to modify the weather. They can use any method, any type of modification, any chemical, any particle, any program. And as long as, for example, I can hire a weather modification company right now, and I can ask them to enhance the snow over Mendocino County,